Shomita,
So now we can start.
okay. Shomita, please check whether RL sir is there. Shomita,
Yes, sir, I can hear you.
check whether
Just
RL
a
sir
minute.
is there.
I just saw sir was there. I don't know. Now I can't find his name.
Okay,
Yes, sir, he's there.
he is there. I'm just trying to talk to him. Sir, RL sir, are you there?
Sir, your microphone has been muted. Please unmute it. Hello?
My microphone.
Na, mane sir,
Okay, RL sir.
sir's microphone.
Uh, Sir, please unmute yourself. RL sir, please unmute yourself. We are going to start our program. So I request you to unmute yourself.
Do you get me?
Yes, I can hear you. I can hear you. Okay. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Hello?
Shomita, please check whether RL sir can hear us.
Audible হচ্ছে না, একটু নেটওয়ার্ক ইস্যুস হচ্ছে। Hello?
Can you hear me properly?
Yes,
But
sir,
I
now
get
it
your
is.
voice very distinctly.
Okay,
I
okay.
get your voice.
Okay.
Okay. So now we are starting. Okay.
Well, hi everybody. Wish you all a robust and resilient good morning at a time like this. Let me invite Professor Dipankar Rai to this virtual platform to hold forth on what he has kindly consented to take up. The topic chosen is the modernist poetics, reading Eliot's tradition and individual talent. The essay is a milestone in the history of literary criticism in that you have here a wonderful mix of historical and conceptual frames, with Eliot shuffling back and forth across time to illustrate his point. His thesis of the dialectics of tradition and individual talent behind every poetic enunciation. Since its publication, the essay has been all along very contested and problematic. Now, we are all eager to hear from Dr. Roy how this essay reflects on and is reflected by the modernist poetics. So, let it begin. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ranubidya, for such a wonderful introduction. So let me just introduce Dr. Roy. Dr. Roy has been teaching in the Department of English, Vishwabharati Shantiniketan, since 2003. He has a doctoral degree from Jadavpur University, where he worked on Rabindranath Tagore's fiction. His book on Rabindranath Tagore's fictions in Tagore's own country came out in 2015. He is one of the contributors to Towards Tagore, the 150th birth anniversary commemorative volume published by Vishwabharati. Apart from Tagore, his essays on subjects ranging from Bengal Renaissance to Rudyard Kipling's Kim, from R.K. Narayan's Malguri Days to Bibhutibhushan Bandyopadhyay's Aranyok have been published in reputed national and international journals and books. He is also the recipient of the Isaac Sequoia Memorial Award for writing on Amitav Ghosh's novel, The Hungry Tide. He has also edited a book, Timeless Tales from Bengal, an anthology of Bangla children's and young adult stories. And his research areas include post-colonial studies, literary theory, And recently, he has also written a beautiful, wonderful book in Bangla called Sada Thako Anande Shante Niketone, which is published from Oxford University Press. And at last, I just want to say on a slightly personal note that he is my PhD supervisor and guide. So, welcome, Dr. Dipankar Rai, to our 2-day web lecture series, the first day of our web lecture series. So now I request you to start your presentation.
Thank you so much for those kind words. And let me also offer my heartfelt thanks to the principal of Vijayawada College as well as the faculty of English department, especially to Professor Lahiri for introducing in such a easy manner the issues that are pertinent if we have to do a close reading of Eliot's very famous essay. I personally think that Professor Lahiri would be a better person to talk about this essay than me. Nevertheless, I would like to take this opportunity primarily because I am sure that this lecture series is aimed at sharing resources from one institution to other institutions in these trying times. And I really enjoy this opportunity of reaching out to my students in different colleges. And I, for the moment, would blatantly declare that my today's talk is going to be another of those classroom lectures. This is not going to be any polemical study on Eliot's critical career or the essay in particular. I would try to do with the students of Vijayawada College and any other student who has joined in this virtual meeting to share my views on the essay, just the way I share my views with my own students in my department during classroom discussions. Thank you all. Thank you indeed. Now, what I will try to do in my presentation is to focus exclusively on traditional individual talent, do a close reading, as they say, of the text, and if possible, we will look at Eliot's career of early poetry and try and find out any possible relationships between Eliot's critical design as presented in this essay and the kind of poetic practice that he was involved in. So let me just go to my presentation and we shall begin with the first slide in a moment. Right. So I think everybody can see clearly my presentation. There is no technical glitch, as it were. So I have moved on to the first slide right away. Now, the things that I have to share with you in my first slide are very well-known facts. But just to set the ball rolling, just to map the terrain, I am once again drawing your attention to certain very primary features of the contexts out of which Eliot's particular essay emerges. Now, Proofrock and Other Observations, the book of poems that was published in 1917, comprises a few of his iconic poems. For example, the book opens with Love Song of J. Alfred Proofrock, which has been a perennial favorite with students and readers of modernist poetry. And this ushered in a new era in modern poetry. Now, when we talk about modern, there are a lot of confusions vis-a-vis the use of words like modernity and modernism. But here I use the word modern primarily in the modernist sense. If we get an opportunity some other time, we will discuss modernity in general. But right now, let us concentrate on the term modernism. Now, for
Excuse me,
Yes.
Dipankar da, slide is not visible, I think, the slide.
Okay, let me just check whether there is any technical glitch or not.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No
the
problem.
slide,
Uh,
Prosenjit, are you
I need
there?
to go to share screen button, right?
Hello.
Obviously.
Hello.
Where is
Hello.
the share screen button?
Is the slide visible from the speaker?
No. Some Kaushiki Ghosh is coming.
Kaushiki,
I don't
please
know
remove.
who is Kaushiki Ghosh.
Please remove Kaushiki Ghosh. Please remove Kaushiki Ghosh.
Okay, I am removing her.
Okay, please remove Kaushiki Ghosh.
So, present now. Please keep your presentation at the screen, and then press the present now button at the right bottom corner of Google Meet platform. Yes, now it's visible.
Is it visible right now?
Yes,
Is it visible
yes.
now? Okay.
It's visible.
Right. Thank you for the technical help. As you can very well understand that I belong to the older generation. The
No
generation.
problem, sir. It's not a problem.
Anyway, so back to our discussion. Now, I was trying to present my first slide, and as you can now see, hopefully you can see that the title of my first slide is Eliot the Modernist. In my first slide, I will refer to certain very well-known facts about literary modernism in America and in Europe. And Eliot's book, Proofrocks and Other Observations, which was published in 1917, marked the beginning of a new era in modern poetry. Now, when we talk about modern poetry, I think we should very briefly look at the political, the historical, the cultural, the aesthetic, and also the technological backgrounds of that particular period. Now, if you consider the political and social background of that period, one has to take into account these particular features. I mean, all these are very well-known facts, but just to warm things up, just to get the groove going, I have mentioned certain particular events that occurred during that time. Of course, the spreading of certain large-scale use of certain technological devices like the telephone, the cinema, the automobile, and the aeroplane. Incidentally, I would like to share with you a fact that a couple of days back, I was having a similar kind of discussion, web discussion with my students from another college, and there I was discussing Walter Benjamin's author as producer. But there also Benjamin talks at length about the technological advancements that happened during the beginning of the 20th century that made its impact, a very deep impact on the culture and especially on the art of that period. And same applies to poetry as well. But here, along with technological advancements, along with certain paradigmatic change in the political sphere in the form of a 5-year-long war, which we know as the World War I, we also have certain intellectual inventions, certain new discourses coming into play. In 1913, in England, for the first time, Freud's works in English translations were made available. And this was also the time in which Einstein's theory of relativity was becoming popular, was known to people. So all these changes, political changes, social changes, technological changes, intellectual changes, were making their presence felt in the realm of art. Art was also trying to negotiate with these advancements. Art was trying to come up with certain hybrid forms. The developments that were taking place in the realm of photography, the developments that were taking place in the realm of cinema, the technological principles, the aesthetic principles of those art forms were beginning to be felt in other realms of art. Cinema influencing theater. We all know how Bertolt Brecht introduced certain cinematic principles in his epic theater, principles like montage. We also know how photography influenced painting. So in addition to political, social, and technological changes, we also have certain cultural aesthetic changes, direct cultural aesthetic changes in the form of the exposure to French symbolism. We all know that how Eliot was deeply influenced by Arthur Symon's books, which came out in 1899 about the symbolist movement of poetry in France, and also the first post-impressionist exhibition that was held in 1910 in London. And Ezra Pound and his introduction of a new, completely new poetical exercise known by the term imagism, which happened during 1912. So in addition to these changes, political, social, technological, cultural, aesthetic changes, one very important thing about literary modernism, about modern literature, modern art, modern poetry in particular, is of course the presence of the city life, urbanity, urban consciousness. If you want to know in detail what is the nature of this urban consciousness, I would strongly advise you to again go back to Walter Benjamin and read his book-length study on Charles Baudelaire. There he talks at length about the nature of urban consciousness and how the very principle of shock experience is the cornerstone of urban art, and how the moving about from one street to another without any fixed plan, almost aimlessly, the walking about, which the French would call flânerie. Now, modern poet as a flaneur, somebody who would roam the streets of the city, of the metropolitan cities, especially those areas which are its underbelly. So Eliot also experienced this city life in the form of, when Eliot was in France, when Eliot was in Germany in the early years of the 20th century, he was reading not only French poetry, Laforgue in particular, but he was also reading Crime and Punishment, the very famous classic of Fyodor Dostoevsky. Now, he was experiencing urban consciousness as recorded in modernist art, and he was also experiencing city life in person. He was raised in downtown St. Louis and he was educated in Cambridge, but he was also an urbanite, and he was in the habit of wandering the streets of Boston, London, and Paris. So all these things form the backdrop of Eliot's mentality. And this, in turn, not only influenced the poetic output of Eliot during his early years. I'm talking about the pre-Wasteland period. I'm talking about his first collection of poems called Proofrocks and Other Observations. Now, when Eliot was composing these poems, some 5 or 6 after, when he had already composed Rhapsody on a Windy Night or Portrait of a Lady or Preludes, he also was trying out his hand in writing works of literary criticism. Now, this takes Eliot to that selected group of poet critics in the British tradition. Poet critics like John Dryden, like Samuel Johnson, and Matthew Arnold. Eliot joins this band. Now, when a poet tries to become a critic, or when a poet functions as a critic, that gives the poet an additional edge in the sense that the poet as a critic can validate the kind of poetry that he's trying to write, and will try to figure out whether the same is true for Eliot or not. But there is no denying the fact that he saw his literary criticism as a way of improving the appreciation of his own art. And when his early works of poetry were getting published in avant-garde journals like Poetry, like Blast, like others, his so-called revolutionary poems that the critics were rather puzzled as how to accept those poems like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. During this particular year, Eliot was also writing pieces of literary criticism. And I would like to draw your attention to three. Eliot, performed this task of a critic throughout his career, and from a literary critic, he gradually went on to become a critic of culture. We are not going into the later phase of Eliot's critical career. We are concentrating for our present discussion the first phase of Eliot's critical outputs. And I would request you to read at least two of his other essays alongside Tradition and Individual Talent. Tradition and the Individual Talent was, of course, published in 1919. And these two other texts were published in close succession. Hamlet and His Problems was published in 1919, and The Metaphysical Poets was published in 1921. And these texts were published in journals like The Egoist, The Little Review, and The Athenaeum, and also in newspapers like Times Literary Supplement. Now, if you focus your attention to at least these three texts, you are sure to get taste of three very important concepts that later day historians of literary criticism associate Eliot with. This is, of course, Eliot's position vis-a-vis the conflict between classicism and romanticism. Eliot is often considered as a classicist who was trying to turn away from the 19th century romantic tradition. We'll look into this later as we move into our discussion proper. And of course, Eliot is also famous for his impersonal theory of art. He introduces this concept in Tradition and the Individual Talent. And the two other technical terms that we always associate with Eliot is, of course, objective correlative and dissociation of sensibility. Now, Eliot was rather embarrassed with the popularity of these two terms. And Eliot would opine that he did not give as much importance to these terms as the later day critics had given to these terms. Now, about objective correlative is an idea that he introduces. We all know this, but just to do a quick recap, he introduces this idea in his essay called Hamlet and His Problems. And let me quote just a few sentences to brush up our memory, if for nothing else. About objective correlative, he writes, the only way of expressing emotion in the form of art is by finding an objective correlative. In other words, a set of objects, a situation, a chain of events, which shall be the formula of that particular emotion, such that when the external facts, which must terminate in sensory experience, are given, the emotion is immediately evoked. So, with this long quotation, what I'm trying to draw your attention to is how objective comes very close to the idea of an image, and how objective correlative is an artistic construct. Now, in the Tradition and the Individual Talent, Eliot makes a clear-cut distinction between emotions felt in real life, emotions felt by the person, the poet persona, and the recording of those emotions in the art, in poetry. Now, for Eliot, emotion in poetry, poetical emotion and emotion felt in real life are completely different. We'll discuss this as when we shall enter into the discussion of the actual essay. Now, as to the idea of dissociation of sensibility, of course, this takes place in his very, very famous essay called The Metaphysical Poets, and there he refers to the metaphysical poets having the power of a direct sensuous apprehension of thought, or a recreation of thought into feeling. So there is this interchangeability between thought and feeling that the metaphysical poets were capable of. And this is what Eliot calls the unified sensibility, which, according to him, ultimately degenerated after the Civil War and after the introduction of the Commonwealth in British history, during the time of Milton and afterwards. And according to him, a dissociation of sensibility sets in English literary tradition. Now, I try to map this terrain because with this kind of backdrop, we can, in a more comfortable way, enter into the realm of the aesthetic design as presented by Eliot in Tradition and Individual Talent. Now, as the very name suggests, that the essay is supposed to have two different sections. The section comprising Eliot's views on tradition, and of course the second section, the last section, is about the idea of the individual talent. Although the text has got three different sections, let me just give you a few details about the publication history of this particular essay. It will come in handy. The essay was originally appeared in two parts in the final two numbers of The Egoist, and was then subsequently combined in the collection of essays called The Sacred Wood. The first installment was published in The Egoist in the September issue. It comprised what is currently part 1 and was composed sometime in August 1919, when Eliot returned from France. And the second appeared in the same journal in its December issue, and it comprised parts 2 and 3, and was finished around 18th of December in 1919. So, going back to the first part of the essay, that is the essay, that is the part in which Eliot discusses his views about tradition. Now, I have tried to find out certain nodal points which I have identified in the first section, and I'll try to go from one point to the other so that we can have a journey along with Eliot in his presentation of the thesis of his idea of the tradition. Right now, he begins with a reference to the French literary tradition, and he gives his impression that we generally understand the French to be more critical in nature. That is to say that in French literary tradition, they have a richer tradition of criticism, which Eliot laments the British literary tradition does not seem to have. And he is trying to put the tradition of literary criticism at the very center of any literary history, especially of English literary history. For him, critical attitude is as spontaneous as breathing. And and when he discusses this idea of the importance of, rather, to have a critical attitude, the first idea that he introduces in this essay is the idea of the historical sense. Now, for him, the historical sense is not merely, of course, the idea of the historical sense is intimately associated with Eliot's idea of the tradition. Now, when a poet has to be judged, generally, Eliot finds that in English literary tradition, a poet is judged for his originality, how original the poet is. Eliot tries to go to the opposite way. For him, if you want to judge a poet, we have to place his work within or beside the tradition of poetry that his country has, and then judge his or her success or failure. Right now, in order to judge, in order to place a poet within the historical tradition of the literature of the country, not only the critic has to have a historical sense, but the poet who's trying to compose poetry, one who really wants to become a poet during his mature years, has to have a historical sense. Now, for him, this historical sense is intimately associated with the idea of the tradition, and this is not merely about an idea of history. Eliot is not looking at history as an inert record of past events. For him, history is organic. History is something which is alive. And that is why when somebody wants to develop the historical sense, one has to develop a sense of history and then balance it with his own emotions and passions from objective criticism. So a poet's perception of the past, should be of an organic nature. The pastness of the past and its presence are something that has to be taken into account. So let me just give you a very easy example. Now, those of us who have read The Burial of the Dead, the opening section of The Wasteland, the first few lines begin with reference to the month of April. And there is no denying the fact when we read or when we try to teach The Wasteland, we have to refer to Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales, his beginning of the prologue of the Canterbury Tales. Now, these days it is almost impossible to read Chaucer's prologue without making a detour to Eliot's The Wasteland. So this is what I'm trying to say by making the past alive. Whenever a new work of art, whenever a new text, a new poem enters into the realm of tradition, it not only engages itself with the dialogue of the past tradition, but if it is a truly original work of art, Eliot opines, it will change the existing tradition just a wee bit, right? So, so Eliot is not looking at tradition as an inert, an authoritative canon, something that is fixed, something that is all-powerful, and the poet has to be judged by this almost absolute constant of canonicity. No. But at the same time, even if he does not give too much importance to the authoritative position of canonicity, of tradition, of the historical sense, but at the same time, he does not forget to mention that when a poet is trying to create works of art, he or she has to give more importance to the mind of his country. He should not restrict, he or she should not restrict oneself within the mental makeup of his own personality. He should, consider the larger construct of the literary tradition, the canon to which his works of art would belong to. Now, when Eliot talks about tradition, when Eliot talks about the literary canon, and when he wants the poet to become trained in an understanding of the literary canon, he sets very high standard. He refers to a vast span of tradition, a tradition which would encompass the entire literature of Europe, starting from Homer to present day, to contemporary literature. Now, it is very significant to note that Eliot expects such a vast erudition, almost a ridiculous amount of erudition. He uses the adjective ridiculous himself in traditional individual talent for the training of a poet. This is very interesting given the fact that Eliot was by birth an American, and he was trying to establish himself as a part of a literary tradition that was not his own, at least not by his birth. He was trying to become, he was trying to be considered as a British poet, as a European poet. So for him, it was necessary to refer to not only the British tradition of literature, but also European tradition of literature. This is something that we have to keep in mind. And again, to go back to the other point, the other nodal point about tradition, and I think I've already mentioned this, but since I have included it in my graphical presentation, let me just tell you briefly about it. the very organic nature of tradition. Tradition is something that keeps on changing, and tradition is a space where the counterpointing of the past and the present takes place almost always, and the past gets altered by the present as much as the present is influenced by the past. Now, the poet can approach tradition in this flexible manner. The poet can only make use of this tradition, this lively tradition, this organic tradition, when the poet will undergo a process of depersonalization. Eliot famously refers to the catalyst formula, where the mind of the poet functions very much like a catalyst. Although speaking from the point of view of chemistry, he got it slightly wrong, but nevertheless, his metaphor holds ground, and this process of depersonalization refers to an extinction of personality. The poet has to surrender his or her personality, and in order to appreciate work of art, in order to appreciate poetry, we have to move away from the artist's own emotions and to focus our attention to art. So this is a clear-cut departure from the romantic position. Now, those of us who have read Image Abrams' famous book called The Mirror and the Lamp, in the introduction of that book, Image Abrams presents us with a triangular formulation of how different nodal points in the history of criticism, art criticism, occurred in Europe. And for the romantic tradition, Abrams uses the term expressive criticism, where the subjective poetry, subjective idealism and its associated poetry, I'm referring to poetry of Coleridge, Wordsworth and others, poets who were deeply influenced by continental philosophy. Now, there the focus was primarily on the feelings and emotions that the poet would experience, and then record those emotions and feelings onto art. But here, Eliot is trying to move away from that position. He is taking an anti-romantic position, and for him, the poet's mind would remain unchanged before and after the composition of the poem. And by referring to an event from the world of chemistry, Eliot is trying to give a scientific rigor to the discipline of literary criticism. He is trying to move away from the impressionistic criticism. He is trying to, trying to build up a scaffold of literary criticism which would be systematic in nature. And we all know how new critics and practical critics were influenced by Eliot's works. We don't have much time to discuss those things, but the point that we need to keep in mind right now is how we are moving from a subjective understanding, theorization of art to an objectivist theory of art, what Eliot would call an impersonal theory of art. Now we move on to the next slide. This is, of course, about the individual talent, the other half of the argument. Now, here, Eliot focuses his attention on the poet and how the poetical process would involve the poetic sensibility and what methods the poet is supposed to follow. Now, the first point that Eliot refers to in the second part of the essay is, of course, the poetry is a living whole. Poetry is something which has to be placed, a particular poem has to be placed with other poems. A poem has to enter into a dialogue with other poems. And this dialogue would result in different kinds of appreciation of poetry. Now, this can only happen when the emotions and feelings of the poet would undergo certain radical transformations. would undergo poetical processes, and out of the emotions and feelings of the poet, new art emotion would emerge. And in this transformation of emotions, personal emotions and feelings of the poet's mind would function like a receptacle. Now, poet's mind would be a reservoir of images and feelings and phrases and images. And these images and feelings would not be recorded in poetry, in the poems that the poet composes, in a direct one-to-one manner. In the reservoir of the poet's mind, these phrases, these images and feelings would get involved in all kinds of permutations and combinations. And the end product would be a completely new kind of emotion, which Eliot calls as art emotion. Now, this art emotion can happen only when the poet would engage in a dialogue with the tradition. So here we once again we see that there is, and here of course the elusive technique of Eliot comes to the surface. Even we are all familiar with a number of allusions that Eliot makes use of in many of his poems, and we find it almost impossible to know the sources of all these allusions, so much so that Eliot himself had to write annotations for his text, The Wasteland. And these days we also have to read annotated editions of works of poetry by Eliot, annotations made by scholars like Grover Smith, and in India somebody like Manju Jain. We have to consult their books in order to locate these annotations. But we have to remember that these elusive technique is not to make poetry abstruse or not to show off the poet's erudition. That is not the intention of the poet. The intention of the poet is to place his works within the larger rubric of tradition and to make tradition come alive. So this combination, this particular act of combination, fusion, amalgamation of emotions and feelings by adopting certain elusive techniques, Eliot would call the poetic process as transmutation of passion into something unforeseen. So Eliot would think of individual talent as something where poetry steeped in tradition would approach the vacuous world of modernity, of modern life, modernism. So the elusive technique would serve the function of a scaffold, where Eliot, in the case of a text like The Wasteland, would talk about his mythical method. So these allusions would help the poet to engage in a dialogue with the tradition. Now, this takes us to a rather complicated situation, where on the one hand, we can say that Eliot shows certain tendencies of classical outlook, where Eliot would champion the importance of tradition. Eliot would expect the poet to undergo certain trainings. On the other hand, Eliot does not want to be burdened by tradition. So there seems to be a dialectics involved between tradition and individual talent. In my next slide, I want to draw your attention to certain factors that are operational in Eliot's scheme of things, in Eliot's design of presenting tradition and individual talent, the ideas of tradition and individual talent side by side. Now, tradition is something that Eliot mentions cannot be inherited. You have to work for it. It must be obtained with great labor. Something but on the other hand, the tradition that we have to acquire through hours of reading is something that we cannot make use of in a direct one-to-one manner, because many elements of this tradition have lost their original relevance. So tradition turns out to be something that we can neither do away with, nor we can make the fullest possible use. So this takes us to a position, a curious position, where tradition hovers between presence and absence. And this intermediate position of presence and absence, this interstices of presence and absence of modern life, can be captured by the elusive technique adopted by the poet by reference to texts that belong to the literary canon of one's own country or even to one's own continent. So tradition is not inert. It is a site of lost order that can generate new forms of expression, commensurate with ironically self-aware situation of the modern artist. Now, those of us who have read Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock would know that Eliot borrowed from tradition, not only from the tradition of French symbolist poetry, but also from Victorian tradition of poetry. After all, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock is a particular example of the dramatic monologue. So Eliot, by selecting certain writers, we are all familiar with his fascination for the metaphysical poets, his fascination for Dante, and his fascination for somebody like Charles Baudelaire. So by engaging himself by selecting certain ages, certain eras of the European literary tradition, Eliot is able to bring out certain modifications to age-old forms, genres, and ways of writing. So again, you see, it is, I don't know how far it would be correct to label Eliot as a classicist, because he does not believe in the supreme authority of an inert tradition. For him, tradition is something that is open to innovation, that is open to change, that is open to interpretive option, that is open to individual creativity. If a really new powerful poet comes to the scene, the poet with his works, with his or her works, will be able to make changes to tradition. I can give you an example from closer home. Now, with the works of Rabindranath Tagore, I mean, I don't think Vaishnav Padaboli would never remain the same. Now, these days, if somebody has to read Vaishnav Padaboli, one has to remember the exploits of Tagore, the poet, in practicing works of poetry which are similar to Vaishnav Padaboli. Right. So we I throw open this question. So can we call Eliot somebody like a crypto-romantic who is trying to, on the one hand, offsetting excessive subjectivism? In the last section of the poem, Eliot is referring to certain formula presented by William Wordsworth. So he's criticizing William Wordsworth, but with the criticism of excessive subjectivism of romantic poetry, Eliot is also at the same time critical of fictional and dramatic realism. He would not be somebody who would be a champion of naturalism. So he is trying to critique not only subjective idealism, but he's also not a supporter of naturalistic works of art. He would not be a great admirer of somebody like Emile Zola. Why? Because for him, artists should not seek to represent the existing world, but should constitute a new world with a new order of intensity in the world of his emotions. So, artistic realm, art world, is primarily different from the world of reality. Art as artifice is something that Eliot is trying to foreground in this essay. And this makes him a truly modern artist in the sense that modernism both in the sense of modernity and also in the sense of the urban, existential, and fragmented nature of modern life, refers to a condition which elicits an estranged tradition, and it tries to transform it into a distinctively modern idiom. So in Eliot's poetry, that is how in Eliot's poetry we find a blending of pathos and humor, and with the possibilities of recuperation. So Eliot is trying to use the scaffold of tradition to express the vacuity of modern day existence. Without the scaffold of the traditional framework, it would be very, very difficult for him to express the nothingness of modern day existence. So that is how we see a dialectical process is in operation, even in an early text like Tradition and the Individual Talent. Now, before we conclude our discussion, let us just try to go to Eliot's Proofrock poems, just to see what Eliot was trying to do. Mind you, most of his Proofrock poems, in fact, all of his Proofrock poems were composed before the composition of Tradition and the Individual Talent. But we will try and find out whether there is a tendency of validation in the Traditional Individual Talent of the kind of poetry that Eliot was writing. Many of these, most of these poems were published, had been written 8 years before the Traditional Individual Talent essay. He wrote Portrait of a Lady and Preludes in 1910, and he began these poems and he completed these poems in 1911, along with the Love Song of the Alfred Proofrock and Rhapsody on a Windy Night. He was staying in Paris and Munich during that time. And if you read these poems carefully, if you read a poem like Preludes, or if you read a poem like the Love Song of J. Alfred Proofrock, one of the first things that strikes you is, of course, how Eliot is playing with different personas. Proofrock is, of course, the most obvious one, and these personas are animated by their ruptured relationship to the tradition. These persona keep on referring to textual events, refer to other literary texts, other philosophical texts. There is a strong presence of Bergson, Henri Bergson in Love Song of J. Alfred Proofrock and in Preludes. And of course, Eliot, the student of philosophy, you know that he wrote a thesis on the philosophy of F.H. Bradley, A.C. Bradley's brother. So his readings of philosophy, his readings of other fields of knowledge system deeply influenced his works of poetry, and he is able to present persona which share this almost love-hate relationship with the tradition. And this is to highlight their in-betweenness. They are posited between two worlds. Past and present are fused together in peculiar and unexpected ways in these poems, and which compel our attention through the surprising and often complex relations that they establish. And the spiritual impoverishment that the settings of these poems draw our attention to are blended with certain psychological tendencies, certain almost ritualistic exchanges that take place in modern day drawing room. And Eliot's allusions try to bridge a gap between the spiritual impoverishment and the vacuous, empty rituals that the high society of urban existence are quite familiar with. Now, this union of the resolutely self-sacrificial and the fastidiously trivial exhibits those new and sudden combinations that Eliot associates with poetic creativity. This is the point that we have to understand rather well, because this blending this bringing together two different kinds of materials from the tradition and the quasi-humorous, quasi-satirical, ironical noting downs of the modern life. These bringing together of these two heterogeneous elements are something that, according to Eliot, are the hallmarks of the poetic creativity. Eliot associates this blending, this new and sudden combinations with poetic creativity, the gift for combining, for fusing into a single phrase, or two or more diverse impressions. Now, again, you see, I don't know whether how far it is relevant in this reading of Eliot's essay, but I'm reminded of, again, another very important essay by Walter Benjamin, one of the last essays that he wrote. It is basically a fragment. It's a collection of fragments. It is called Understanding History or On History. Sometimes it's called Thesis on the Philosophy of History. There, Benjamin is trying to put forward the idea that tradition is something not inert. Past is not something inert. History, the official history, is nothing but a collection that the victors create out of cultural artifacts. So the history that we understand as a record of past events is a history that is recorded, codified, and written by the dominant classes of the society. Now, in order to engage in a dialectical way with the historical records, one has to make the past come alive once more, and one has to unite the tradition in a major way. So I find there are a lot of similarities between the Eliotist views of tradition and how the poetic creativity would involve a recreation, a reorganization of past with the ideas expressed by Walter Benjamin. Now, this poetic creativity, this ability to combine the old and the new, to come up with very astonishing combinations, is something that Eliot associates with. Now, I would associate with certain authors in English literary tradition. Of course, Eliot keeps on referring to the works by Shakespeare, Donne, and their contemporaries, as well as he finds this in Laforgue and the French symbolists, and he himself tried to cultivate it throughout his early works of poetry. And this is, I conclude my discussion with referring to one particular comment made by Eliot in his essay Tradition and Individual Talent, where he writes that the historical sense is something that involves the ability to write with not merely with his own generation in his own bones, but with the feeling of the whole literature of Europe. Thank you.
Sir, due to some reason, your screen was not presented for the last 10 to 15 minutes. So could you please re-present the screen of particularly the slides on Proofrock and the dialectics between tradition and individual talent?
I don't know what went wrong.
No, it was visible. Subhadra Kalyan, we could all see it. So I will give you that.
Okay, thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
I can always share my PowerPoint presentation with Abhishek so that he can distribute it among all the students. But yes,
no problem. We have already seen the presentation, and once again, thank you very much for such an engaging, enriching, and wonderful presentation. I think my students, all the students who have participated, and we also are very much enriched by your lecture. We have some questions. I'm just reading those out. Divankarta, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. This is a question from Abhin Chakraborty. He asks,
I can see some questions on screen.
Yes, sir.
Luigi Dash has got a question. Now,
I am taking the questions one by one.
Yes, sir.
I'm taking the questions one by one, Dipankarda. So the first question is from Abhin Chakraborty. He's asking, how does one look at the concept of tradition in light of Eliot's anti-Semitism and the post-conversion religious dogmatism?
now, this would take our discussion to a completely different trajectory. Now, a lot has been said about Eliot's anti-Semitic position, and I don't think I have anything to add to that. In my presentation, what I was trying to do was to focus on the particular relationship between Eliot, the critic, and the kind of poetry that he was trying to write, or the poetical works that he had already composed. Now, there I don't think the famous comment made by famous, or I don't know whether you should call it infamous, that he was a royalist by politics and classicist by taste and Catholic by religion. I don't think tradition and individual talent throws any light on Eliot's supposedly anti-Semitic stance. And Eliot, the conservative thinker that he turned out to be. Now, I personally think that there are several Eliots. I mean, for me, Eliot of the Wasteland is not quite the same as the Eliot of Four Quartets. Certain changes occurred, but then again, and you know, in the very essay itself, at one point, Eliot is trying to denigrate the idea of the metaphysical unity of the soul. He is trying to put forward the idea of what the French would call dos doublement. So different personas, different facets. So as far as the essay traditional individual talent is concerned, I personally don't think that his anti-Semitic position or his conservative attitude towards religion and politics are all that relevant. If you want to take into account his later day works like Notes Towards Definition of Culture or After Strange Gods, I think that would be more relevant. And of course, by and large, religious text or a spiritual poem like Four Quartets. I don't know whether I've answered your question or not, but that is all I have to say right now. Yes, Abhishek.
Okay. There is another question. This is from Tritoma Roy. The question is, does Eliot's particular notion of tradition tend to connect poetry to larger historical processes, or does it isolate the world of poetry from the world of social reality?
Yes, that is a very pertinent question. And I would say that Eliot's tradition and individual talent has, I would not say ample evidences, but certain possibilities that Eliot, from charting a course for literary criticism, would one day end up being a cultural critic. So, but here in tradition and individual talent, Eliot is hovering between literary criticism proper and his theories of art in general. So if you want to incorporate, if you want to deal with larger sets of artistic activities, if you want to incorporate art, fine arts and music, I think that Eliot's tradition and the individual talent refers to a larger notion of tradition, not exclusively the literary tradition. And by the reference to a term like the historical sense, I think Eliot is opening up possibilities. And I quite agree with you that literature is something that one has to place alongside other cultural practices. Not only that, you know, in the beginning of my discussion, I passingly referred to Benjamin's essay, The Author as Producer. There, Benjamin would argue that in order to appreciate a work of art, one has to see the work of art not vis-a-vis the modes of production, but the position of art within the production process. So if you can use that concept in the question of tradition, I think you can come up with a more materialistic reading of tradition and a more dialectical reading of tradition as well. Yes, that is all that comes to my mind right now.
Thank you. There are two more questions from our students. Orijit Das, he asks, Eliot says poetry is not turning loose of emotion, but an escape from emotion. Again, he propounded the fact that the business of a poet is not to find new emotions, but to use the ordinary ones. So my point is, if the poet uses ordinary emotions, how is this even possible for him to escape from emotions?
Yes, Orijit. Well, I don't quite find these two statements all that contradictory. To my understanding, what Eliot is trying to say is that you have to have emotions and feelings in the first place. I mean, no matter how impersonal a poet is, the poet has to have his own reservoir of emotions. What he's trying to say is that there must not be a direct one-to-one correspondence between the emotion that he feels and the emotion that gets recorded in art. The emotions and the feelings of the poet would comprise a reservoir, would comprise a database in your parlance, out of which the poet would create something new. I suppose you have noticed that at one point of the essay, Eliot refers to Keats's Nightingale. He writes that Keats's Nightingale is associated with a number of emotions which would have no direct connection with the bird nightingale. So what he's trying to say is that, and by referring to the incident from the world of chemistry, he's drawing our attention to a kind of chemical reaction. Now you have certain ingredients in the form of emotions and their feelings in the minds of the poet. Those emotions and feelings might remain inert for a long period of time. But when the poet engages himself or herself in writing a poem, those emotions and feelings would undergo changes, would become emotions and feelings of a different order. And the artistic emotion is radically different from the emotions felt by the poet, right? So the artistic emotion could be created in works of art only when the poet would be able to get rid of his or her ordinary emotions in a direct one-to-one manner, right? So the position that he's challenging is the position adopted by somebody like William Wordsworth. Spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, right? So the very idea of spontaneity, you know, it is as if the poet feels certain emotions, then he sits down with pen and paper and writes down those emotions. Eliot wants to break this chain. For Eliot, art is an artifice which requires a lot of skill, a lot of training, even a lot of weight on the part of the artist, on the part of the poet, to create something new, something of a completely different order. Art and reality for Eliot does not reflect each other in an unproblematic manner. Again, the question of dialectics comes into play. I don't know whether I've answered Orijit's question or not.
I think that very much answers that question. But he has another question. He asks, can Eliot's impersonal theory be compared with Keats's negative capability?
In a way, you can say that, but Eliot is more concerned with the introduction of a dialogue with the past. For Eliot, this impersonal theory of art has got two facets. The first facet is, of course, how the poet himself would engage with the idea of tradition. And secondly, that is very important, sometimes we tend to overlook that, is how to, when appreciating a work of art, we have to posit a particular literary text alongside other works of literature in that particular tradition. Now, I don't think Keats has anything to say vis-a-vis the appreciation of the work of art. For Eliot, mind you, Eliot's essay, in the beginning of our discussion, Ranobir Babu has quite rightly pointed out that Eliot's essay, tosses between a descriptive position as well as a prescriptive position. Sometimes he's giving certain prescriptions for poets to write poetry, and some other times he is trying to describe the particular kind of relationship that exists between a poet and the tradition to which he or she belongs to. Right. So from that point of view, I think Eliot's impersonal theory of art is a much larger context with greater possibilities.
Thank you, Dibonkartap. I think that very much answers the question. And there is one more question from Shinchon Dasgupta. It's a kind of comparative question. He says, like Eliot, Hemingway in his iceberg theory suggests that an author's knowledge should be vast compared to his creation, while on the other hand, he prioritizes completely subjective portrayal of experience in literature. Hence, can it be said that Hemingway's perception of what constitutes tradition in literature is in a unique contrast with Hemingway's iceberg theory?
Well, to begin with, I must confess that I'm not quite familiar with Hemingway's iceberg theory in the first place. And secondly, if I want to draw our discussion back to Eliot, and the very little that I understand from your reference to Hemingway's views on creativity and the question of tradition, I would say that for Eliot, tradition is more of a concept that you constantly builds and rebuilds. His idea of tradition is extremely dynamic in nature. That is precisely why I referred to Benjamin's idea of history. History is something that you constantly recreate, that you should always try to recreate. You should not let history be hijacked. You can replace the word history with tradition here. You should not let tradition be hijacked by the dominant class, by the victors of the society, right? So tradition is something that you appropriate. Tradition is something that you make your own. Tradition is something that you contribute to. Tradition is something that you keep alive, right? So, And this is something that draws my attention to the other very, very fascinating similarity between Benjamin and Eliot. And that is both of them are quite happy to give quotations in their works. Even when Benjamin is writing, you're very familiar with the idea that Eliot is giving a quotation one to many in many of his poems, but even in a short essay like traditionally individual talent, he cannot resist himself from giving a quotation from Aristotle. So you see, so this elusive technique or this quotations, trying to give quotations to your works as kind of ornaments is something that are very, very strikingly similar to the things that Benjamin did throughout his life. Benjamin, in fact, was somebody who would collect quotations, and for him, quotations are like, using quotations in works of art are like strategies of guerrilla warfare. I mean, at one point in time, Benjamin refers to his quotations as robbers who rob innocent travelers in some roadside inns. So what, of course, Benjamin is trying to suggest is that these quotations, these elusive technique, makes us rise from our stupor, makes us part of the tradition as readers. So yes, going back to your question, for Eliot, tradition is something that you constantly make and remake. This almost becomes a part of your creative process. So writing a poem is as much about composing an original text as it is about contributing in a profound way to the tradition to which you belong to.
Okay. Thank you, Dipankar. Thank you for answering those questions in such a manner. I think our students are very much enlightened. They are enriched by your lecture and by the way you have answered the questions. I think we all are enriched. Now, I would like to ask one of our faculty member, Shomoita, to please give the vote of thanks, as we feel that we don't have any more questions. So, Shomoita, please unmute yourself and give the vote of thanks.
Yes, sir. After such an enlightening session of, coming to know about Eliot's theory of poetry and his principles of as we go by the title of this session, the poetics of modern poetics of Eliot's poetry. I would like to thank, first of all, our speaker. Thank you so much, sir, for this lucid and comprehensive, presentation, which absolutely has, I am sure, has actually, changed the way the students are now going to think, and how I'm sure it is going to make them more analytical and aware as readers. I would like to thank our principal ma'am for allowing us to have this session and for all the support, and of course our IQSC team for giving us with all the technical support and whatever we had needed for this successful session. That's all.
Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you, Samyata. Thank you, all the faculty and the students of Vijayanagar College. Thank you for inviting me. It was such a delight to be able to discuss certain things that are close to my heart with you, and also to receive your feedbacks. Thank you very much. Till we meet again. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Sir, your camera is on. Sir, your microphone is muted.
Thank you very much, Dibankarda. We are looking forward to have you again in another session where we can hear from you. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, all the participants, our faculty members, our distinguished speaker, and the IQAC team, and all those who are involved in this session. So with that, we are now closing or ending the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
So I am stopping the recording, okay?
Okay, stop the